Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. My name is Roberta Clark, and I welcome you from the Caribbean to this global conversation with the Honorable Mia Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, as part of the inaugural Gender and Development Forum, UNCTAD's 15th session. For our global audience, the Honorable Mia Mottley is the 8th Prime Minister of Barbados and has been active in political life for almost 3 decades. She is someone with a demonstrable breadth and depth of expertise and interest, as capable in political and economic discourse and policy making as she is in many aspects of popular culture. Her presentations are infused with the poetry of Caribbean expression, and she understands our deeply held aspirations for social justice and equitable development. I think her team will agree she seems indefatigable, someone with vision and the ability to motivate and inspire. I think she's that someone who comes along once in many generations in moments like this, when we are called upon to be brave and to be wise, to make the adjustments and the transformations to survive and to thrive. We meet on the anniversary of the UNCTAD Raoul Prebish lecture delivered exactly 2 years to this day, 10th September 2019, by Prime Minister Mottley. On that occasion, Prime Minister Mottley described herself as someone in the business of development. She has been and continues to be, in her words, on a lifelong journey representing and empowering people, giving opportunities and voice. It was also at this time that Barbados committed to hosting the UNCTAD 15th ministerial session, and that Prime Minister Mottley championed this forum to examine the intersecting issues of gender, trade, and development. In her speech of 2 years ago, which I highly recommend as a masterclass in global political economy, Prime Minister Mottley called for moral leadership. She called for a leadership that would guarantee fairness, development, and decency for the people of the world, and especially for those that she refers to as living between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, so long underdeveloped by exploitative and imperialist extraction and equal terms of trade and macroeconomic double standards. She called for reorientation of trade policies that would support both competitive global trade and, importantly, and most importantly, local resilience. Without local resilience, countries are exposed to the vagaries of climate change, as we well know. On small island developing states, we are exposed to the vagaries of food insecurity, crime, terrorism, and social fragmentation, especially as a result of inequalities within and between states. She reminded her audience that true freedom requires changing the structural imbalance in power and wealth in our midst. And I think this is something that feminists all over the world would agree with. In her presentation this week at the Africa Union Caribbean Community Summit, Prime Minister Mottley urged that we, in the words of our poet song master, Bob Marley, emancipate ourselves from the mental slavery that keeps us locked in the middle passage. What we need, she urged us, is direct trade, direct links, direct communications amongst the countries of the Global South. In the context of this Gender and Development Forum, we seek to center the differential experiences of women, men, boys, and girls of the present multiple crises, whether it's the existential crisis of climate change and environmental degradation, the crisis of the pandemic and its implications, or the crisis of the socioeconomic inequalities. We understand that gender inequality exacerbates the harm and the limitations experienced. We see, I think all of us know, how vital is the care economy and how we rely on women's labors in the homes, in schools, and in health facilities. Yet, this indispensable labor is invisible, undervalued, and exploited, much in the same way that the assets and contributions of the Global South are treated. The forum also focuses on the market economy, where women remain unequally inserted, concentrated in the informal economy, often without access to finance or adequate finance, without access to social protection or labor standards. Yet, many women stay resilient and are the shock absorbers for their households, their families, and their communities. This forum demands that the voices of women calling for equality, calling for fairness, calling for development, calling for environmental justice and climate justice be heard. that our influence expanded if the world is to extricate itself from this present steep downward spiral. In this session, this global conversation, we will hear from Prime Minister Mottley her thoughts on the multidimensional crises that we're confronting, and importantly, on what must be done. So on behalf of the organizers, before we start our dialogue, I want to thank Prime Minister Mottley for her championing of this forum, for her backative, as we say in the Caribbean. I want to thank her for her gift of thought and her gift of time. And I want to start by asking your framing question, Prime Minister Mottley. So in 2019, Barbados stepped forward to host this 15th session of UNCTAD. But so much has changed since this offer was made. So much has changed primarily because of the pandemic, but also we're now seeing, if we didn't see it before, we've seen it for a long time, a small island developing state, but many parts of the world are now feeling the effects of the climate crisis. The world continues to undergo profound changes, yes? I think that we know all of what those are. And the changes have been to the national economies, regional economies, and global economies. With long-term implications, we would have to see for how we organize ourselves to live. In small open economies such as ours in the Caribbean, we grapple with indebtedness, with vulnerabilities, reduced revenues, food insecurity, all the things that are so apparent as a result of the pandemic. But people are mistrustful, as we've just spoken about. They're mistrustful of globalization. They're mistrustful of trading arrangements that seem to reproduce inequalities between the global north and the global south. They feel beaten down by violence, by corruption, by troubled governance deficits in many parts of the world. So from the perspective of Barbados, from the perspective of the Caribbean and small island developing states especially, why do you think this UNCTAD 15th session remains relevant, and what are your expectations of it?
I think that, thank you, Roberta, and I really want to thank you and the organizers of this event for the tremendous amount of work that you've done. As I was about to say, I think that the first thing we have to do is to recognize that the choice is ours, how we run the relay. We can drop the baton or we can run with it. And I say so because in a very real sense, one of the difficulties is getting people to appreciate context. And sometimes, especially among younger persons, if they don't believe they can immediately win the battle, they don't try. It is not ours not to try. And I always remember from a young teenager, Dame Billy used to quote me all the time and recite the verse from the Talmud that she kept dear to her, that it is not ours to complete the task, but neither are we at liberty to resile from it. And I start the conversation, therefore, against that background, but with a different metaphor coming as it does after the Olympics and the Diamond League, that we have been watching our women literally soar and become the iconic figures of this year, as opposed to usually the men who are the iconic figures in Caribbean athletics. It has been the women this year. And the image of the relay race that we are running in terms of conquering the deficit that we must conquer to bring our women and our girls to where they need to be is one that motivates us still. There is no doubt in my mind that we are better off than we were from before we had the right to vote in the 1940s. But are we where we need to be in the third decade of the 21st century? No, we are not. And that is why I contextualize it in that manner. UNCTAD, this forum, is to remind us that women are not to be treated as an apostrophe with respect to the provision of opportunities for commerce, ownership, care, all of the other things that we've done well, but that we must now find platforms that allow women not to be invisible, as small island developing states have been for so many, and to begin to create those opportunities that will advance larger and larger numbers of us. Now, will we make it in my generation alone? I'm not going to stand here and tell everybody that I have the capacity or my government has the capacity to reverse all the wrongs, because we know we don't. But what we do have is the capacity to make serious and appreciable progress in this relay race. And whether it is through the UNCTAD Forum that we are doing, whether it is through our domestic development priorities, or whether it is through our international and regional advocacy, then there must be a synergy with respect to the objectives that we want. And what are those objectives fundamentally? And you know, for me, because I want us to reach as many people as we can reach, I try to keep the language simple and break it down simple. What is it that we really want to do? We want to give people the right to be able to eat and to have food. We want decent shelter. We want choice. As Amartya Sen has said, freedom is choice. And especially in our part of the world, where for so long in our modern settlement, citizens in general, but in particular our women, were deprived of the right to make choices for themselves and their families and their bodies. And that choice comes from the power of being able to earn and being able to have a family that is capable of meeting its needs in terms of whether they want education or their health needs or other higher priority needs that we've come to understand are critical for our mental health in terms of leisure, recreation, and spirituality as well. So that when we take all of these things together, I hope that we will create opportunities for women, particularly to be able to be agents of their own prosperity, rather than being a chattel or an ally of someone else's prosperity, as regrettably so many of them have been. And you know, one of the ways in which this hit me here the other day, especially as we seek to move into a post-independence period where we complete the circle of independence in our own selves and seek to make a Barbadian a Bajan head of state, and people look at the honors, and then one of the tensions is, well, will you still have knighthoods? And will you still be able to do those things? And it is, for me, reflective, because when you get a knighthood, the wife of a knight is immediately called a lady. Yeah. When you have a knighthood of a woman, what is the husband of a dame called? Mm-hmm. You understand? And there are all of these symbols and things that continue to reinforce the inferiority of women in the eyes of those who structured our societies in this modern framework. And those reminders have to be confronted, and the agency of a woman being able to plot and chart her own success is what ultimately we're after. So yes, the freedom of choice, but equally the opportunity for prosperity charted by that particular individual as their own deliberate act, rather than being an apostrophe to the whole equation.
And this about I suppose, thinking about the metaphor of the relay race, there are many sort of social justice activists and scholars who are saying, but that relay race is not the race that we need anymore, that there are planetary limits, that we can't continue with the neoliberal model, the market determines production and consumption, that we have to change the race. And just adding women to that race is not going to solve the existential issues that we are dealing with and the inequality issues. And you've spoken quite a bit about that as well. What are your views on this idea? What is the race? What does it look like? What are we going for?
I agree with you that the track has to change, but it's still a relay race. You understand? And the track has to change because, as you pointed out, the developmental priorities of the North Atlantic countries very often do not relate to where we need to be. I mean, you've already said the extent to which it has backfired on the global civilization, largely because it has been simply about extraction, to be able to empower a few. And what we are finding, as I said, and I continue to make the point, is that how do we meet the basic needs first and foremost of persons, I just referred to them, rather than those persons remaining invisible in this equation called democracy. And in a very real sense, democracy has really been simply about the posturing in many instances of some in order to create the illusion for many. And that's not enough. And COVID has shown in real ways all of the underbelly of why that has not been enough. And it has shown the inequity, and it has equally shown, as we are now learning, the extent to which we have to depend on those very same people that we forgot to see for too long, or those very same countries that we forgot to deal with. And what has been, and the metaphor perhaps here is best seen with vaccine inequity or vaccine apartheid, because we knew that if we didn't have equitable distribution of vaccines, that we would allow the opportunity for variants to develop. Yes. And the variants have developed. And the variants are proven more deadly than the original thing. So that this ability to be able to change the narrative, I think that the world in its own way, through climate, through the pandemic, is basically waking us up to recognize that we are on the wrong track. Now, I say relay because in truth and in fact, it is not always easy to explode. Some things will go by revolution and some things will go by evolution. And what I am conscious of is that if we don't contextualize what we're doing, and if we don't moderate people's expectations, we lose them from the crusade. And if we lose them from the crusade, then the ability to reach where we want to reach with an alternative development model becomes that much harder. So I've learned that, especially with younger persons, that there has to be a level of realism and there has to be a level of frank discussion in understanding what we can do and what we can achieve, while at the same time being faithful to the aspirations and being committed to the principles. And it sounds like a lot of words, but what I'm really saying to you is look, we're gonna make it. We're gonna make it, but we can't do everything all at once, and that we need to be able to moderate and to prioritize. And that's what a mother does every day, particularly when she has limited options for how to keep the family together and how to feed them. And in a sense, I keep finding myself going back to metaphors and to the reality of the existence and the journey of women in basic household things, even as we talk about running a country or indeed engaging across the world.
Just this week, Prime Minister Mottley, you spoke about that, the whole notion of the global South countries, small island development states being invisible but yet indispensable. I think that was the way in which you kind of packaged that thought. And it really struck me that that's exactly what we're also saying, those of us who are looking at gender inequality, that the labors of women are indispensable, but they're invisible and they're undervalued.
That's it.
And this reliance on the care economy, all those children who have to stay at home and be schooled there and supervised there, and who are they being supervised for? How do we first of all recognize that care economy, value it, but also have it shared with the state and shared with men? It's one of the questions that we're asking.
Well, I think that the conversations have to start. I mean, in some households, it has happened out of necessity. But the reality is that we need more structure and we need also more sensitization. And what I'm finding is that somehow along the way, we drop the obligation to educate citizens. We need to. And it's an ongoing process. It's not going to happen overnight. And when we look at some of the things that we're asked to do, I ask myself, why are we not taking the time to talk with and to educate each other? I didn't say talk to, I said talk with deliberately. And the preposition matters, because in the Caribbean, for example, and I suspect in almost all former colonies, there is that rawness still from the exploitation which took place in our history. You don't change the DNA of a people overnight or in 1 or 2 generations. And therefore that fear of exploitation and that sense that I'm not being given the opportunities that I could otherwise have continues to stalk the land. Now we have to find a way of overcoming that and to avoid what CLR James described would happen with the West Indian middle class back in the 50s, that they would simply take the place of the previous exploiters and continue merrily along the way. We have to change that framework. And we have to change and understand that, let's start with education. That education must mean each one must matter, not that you continue to educate an elite. That household chores, as we've been talking about, or keeping families together, cannot be seen simply and accepted simply to be the task of women because women are the ones that bear the child. We've seen enough evidence in our society as to why fathering is as critical to a child as mothering a child. We've also seen that the notion in Tanya Stevens' song where she refers in Do You Still Care? Stop the noise, yeah, boy? That too many people have been told over and over and over that boys don't cry. And then what you get is dysfunctional relationships. And then you wonder why we have verbal abuse and why we have physical abuse. And all of these things I'm saying, look, break it down. If I had to describe my time in office, it would come to being the journey of breaking it down. Break it down, deconstruct and reconstruct, deconstruct and reconstruct. Because in a very real sense, and you said it just now, if you keep on the same track that you were going, you're going to end up in the same place that the world has already now found is not sustainable and is not good mentally for our health or fiscally for our condition. So that if this is not a wake-up call, two existential crises, butting their heads against each other, removing the belly, literally the underbelly of discontent and putting it right at the top. It hasn't obliterated it. It's just put it right up top for everybody to see. And then for us now to have to rely on those African and Latin American and Asian and Caribbean countries not to produce the variants. Well, how are they going to not produce the variants if you don't give us the vaccines? Yeah? Or alternatively, for those children in our society who have been deprived of a basic minimum floor as it relates to education and healthcare and community development and access to sports or cultural creativity, which we know to be critical to the mental health of our children. And then we wonder, why the violence?
Yeah.
Why the opting out? So that these things continue, in my view, to stalk us. And if we don't stop now and understand that we have to change the conversation and change the equation and start to reason. Now, I'll give you a perfect example. I clearly support vaccinations. I said so. But can I agree, or can we agree in this nation to potentially put at risk the stability of a country that is 166 square miles by seeking to mandate vaccinations for those who, for either religious reasons, medical reasons, anxiety, or doubt, are not prepared to come forward? It is our judgment that with the history that we have as Caribbean people, that what we will be doing is setting a permanent division that may take another 3-4 generations to remove, if that is where we went. Now, what does that mean? That we have to work harder and smarter to be able to have the one-on-one conversations, to be able to do the heavy lifting, to persuade people. And the key people in this, in my view, are the women. Because as I move around the country, and as I watch what's happening in other Caribbean countries and other developing countries, a lot of the, especially in the Caribbean, a lot of it comes down to rep and it's not cool to do this and it didn't think for, and it's mainly a lot of the men who are on the front line of it. Yes, there's some women, but it's predominantly the men. And the women are very quietly in the households going and getting vaccinated.
Yes.
And going and taking care and holding the center. And then stopping and waiting for the moment to take and say, okay, this really ain't making a sense now. To start to have those one-on-one conversations. And I therefore continue to keep seeing the parallel between small states and women. Some may argue it's because we're both operating from basically a position of discrimination that has been regrettably what we've had to face for too long, and for that lack of power and that lack of capacity to be able to have that agency to chart our future in our own way and in our own deliberate image. And therefore, the metaphors continue to be too powerful for me. So when I therefore had to ask the cabinet, what do we do? Do we come and legislate and go with a heavy hand? Or do we recognize, like most mothers sometimes, that you got to have patience and take time and do the heavy lifting if you want to keep your family together? If you just want to abuse the fella, the boy that bad behavior at 13 and 14 and put him outside, what is going to happen to him? 70% chance that he ain't coming back in this family in any meaningful and sustainable way. And it's no different at the larger level of the country with respect to those divisions that the vaccination movement has thrown up.
Professor Mottley, I want to say a little bit on the theme of COVID, and you spoke about the importance of education, talking with each other, not at each other, and also about the importance of choice. Having capabilities and choice so very important to development at the individual level, and I think we would agree at the level of states. I have some questions from people from around the world, but this question comes from the Caribbean, and I'm just going to read it to get your response. One of our partners from the Caribbean says, the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and also from previous poverty assessments suggest that women's employment relies on tertiary education. Women need to have gone to university to get jobs, so even low-paying jobs, whilst men do not. And these are often fragile jobs and in the first cut when the crisis comes. How then can governments ensure that the COVID-19 recovery, as well as the long-term labor market strategy, can produce more quality jobs for women and in general for everyone? What are we saying about the pipeline from the education to the labor market?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things there. The truth is that I don't accept that women need to have tertiary education to get good jobs. But I do accept that it is more difficult for women without tertiary education to get certain types of jobs. So that's the first distinction that I want to make there. Secondly, when you look at the Caribbean experience, the University of the West Indies has for the last, 15, 20 years, made the statement that the majority of people who are attending the university and seeking to get degrees are in fact women. And the whole debate has taken place as to why don't we have more boys coming forward into tertiary education? Now, this brings me to something which is, to my mind, neither women nor men. It's not gender sensitive. I think that we have to change our outlook for how we educate at the tertiary level in the Caribbean, and to recognize the distinctions between genuine education for the expansion of the mind, which is absolutely necessary for any society. And that is why the university must always be able to have its potential to keep humanities and philosophy and those things going, because without thought, we can't discern and we can't protect and plan for the future. We don't know what is possible. And governments don't deal with possibilities, government deals with probabilities. So we need the academics and the cultural activists and the others to tell us what is possible, and then we deal with what is probable. So that aspect of tertiary education must remain. But what we are not doing well, in my view, is meeting the opportunities of the global economy as we see it today and as reflected in our own indigenous economies. So we have, in the Caribbean, produce a lot of scientists. Some may argue that we should produce more. But when I look at the numbers here in Barbados, we have had over 3,000 Barbadians pursue science within the last 5 years at Cave Hill at UWI. But yet, how many of them have ended up in research? How many of them have ended up in serious use of the science education that they have? And it's largely because there's a mismatch still between where the economies are going and what we're doing both at the genuine university level, or what I call the applied training that takes place in the community colleges and in the skills training programs that we have. And I think that we need to pause and get it right, because we are educating a set of people for here, but we are looking here for another set of people to drive these economies. And you perhaps are better off to also help with some of the discussion, because you did us the distinct favor and privilege of chairing for Barbados its first ever National Population Commission. And I think you have seen, therefore, the extent to which perhaps there ought to be a similar exercise in every Caribbean country. And that was a point I was also making in the CARICOM AU summit earlier this week, because Africa is the youngest continent in the world, with 60% of its population under the age, I think, of 25. And therefore, there's a serious demographic dividend, even beyond that which India has reaped and China before, that needs now to be managed and planned out properly. But at the same time, you have a Caribbean region that is underpopulated and that cannot meet the true challenges that it faces, nor to pursue the level of development that we deserve, because we just simply don't have enough people. Now, you may ask what that has to do with the question that the lady just asked, or the gentleman that asked, because I can't assume it's a lady. It comes back to the reality that I am not sure that we are valuing the skills of our people sufficiently, and then seeking to see how they can build upon that to get the kinds of jobs that they deserve. There is no doubt that there will be a period of time as well that some of these jobs will not be immediately available in our societies. And to that extent, how do we bridge to the global economy and the global workspace to create those opportunities for many of the people that we have? I have found that more often than not, those who are not from us are prepared to give those who are from here a better chance, because they don't see the prejudices that and the biases, the unconscious biases that regrettably people have against women in their own society. Oh, look at her. I didn't like the dress that she used to wear when she was a teenager. You understand? So you immediately X her out. You know nothing but the woman capacity. And it's irrelevant to the job that she have to do. You understand? So that I think that bridging to that global economy by creating those opportunities for many of our women is where we need to go. And that's it can be from the creative areas, it can be in software development, ICT development, it can be in aspects of sharing and teaching, because look at what we're doing. I'm talking to you on Zoom. We can be easily in a class on Zoom. And therefore, I could be in Zimbabwe and you could be in Ethiopia. You could be in Latvia and I could be in Thailand. It doesn't matter. So how do we hone and create the confidence? Because before we create those opportunities, what I've also discovered is that women have first to believe, and girls have first to believe that they can. Yes. And regrettably, too many do not believe that they can. So I think that the conversation has to be much deeper, both at the level of bolstering identity. And that's why in our Covenant of Hope and in our development model, we believe that the reinforcement of national identity and the bolstering of confidence is the most important job for our governments in the new development policy. And that after that, then we can start to deal with the other things coming down. How do I educate and train you? In what? Because you can believe now that you can learn and that you can make it. And then how do I fix the university and the community colleges and the very much online and on-demand training that so much of it exists in the world? But how, while we do that, do I continue to root you where you need to be rooted personally and as a citizen of the Caribbean? Yes.
Ms. Mott, I want to stick with your, or transition from your point on the complementarities in the demography or the demographic transitions in Africa and the Caribbean. You spoke about the demographic dividend of the very youthful population of Africa. We have a question from someone from Botswana who says, is there, given the common economic, social, political inequalities that women in Southern Africa and the Caribbean face, she's asking, is there scope to strengthen technical cooperation South-South to promote a gender equality agenda and a development agenda, more generally speaking? Absolutely. I think you spoke about that this week in the EU
Exactly.
Forum. Yes.
Absolutely. And the devil comes in the detail. You understand? Because it's easy to talk about it, Roberta. We're talking about it. But how do we make it happen? And how do we make it happen as independent states? Because guess what? It happened under the colonial empire.
Yes. Yes.
You understand? So how do we as independent states make it sensitive this time around that it can't be gender unbiased because, I mean, gender biased, sorry, because in the 50s, Kamau went, Courtney Blackman went, we could call all the people who went to Africa to teach, who were there in the heady days as Ghana sought to pursue its independence. But how many went to meet with the market women in Nigeria? And the market women in Nigeria, we now know, were one of the biggest resistance fighters in Africa, in West Africa, in terms of fighting the colonial empire with respect to the level of taxation and the level of other things that they wanted to do to restrict and constrain them. How many now are meeting and seeing what are the opportunities for the production of video and audiovisual materials as you have Nollywood in Nigeria? How many are looking at the opportunities for training where there's a shortage of teachers? I'm happy to say that only this week I spoke to the president of Ghana again and reflected our absolute gratitude for the fact that we have 100 Ghanaian nurses in Barbados helping us on this journey of being able, not just with COVID, because we asked for them before there was a COVID, but we have a shortage of nurses, largely because we keep training and training, and the developed world keeps taking and taking and taking. And there's so many other opportunities. I know that the former principal who is responsible for coordinating all of these for the most honorable, Eudine Barato, has been working feverishly before she left on being able to also get Ghanaian medical students doing some of their first 2 years at Cave Hill. And why are these things important? We don't forget where we study. We don't forget the people that we meet. We don't forget the people that we work with. And if we don't create the opportunities for that platform for sharing, then we will continue on parallel paths and occasionally look over the parapet and say, yeah, we're on the same journey. But what we need now is that detail worked out. So how are we going to get Southern African women teaching in the Caribbean? How are we going to get Caribbean women teaching in Southern Africa? How are we going to tell the stories that we tell our children at night? How are we going to and share the things that we do so that we begin to realize, look, we're really more common than we think. And when we went to Ghana and the Ghanaians came here, there's no doubt in our mind where most of us come from and why Barbados was an Akan-speaking nation in up to the 1670s and 1680s in the 17th century. And a lot of the food and a lot of the things and the manner in which we do things are all the same. But we only know that when we're exposed to each other. So I believe that there's an absolute imperative to create that platform for the movement of people and the movement of goods. And that's why I said earlier this week that the first thing we need to do is to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because too many of our people still see London, still see New York, still see Paris, still see Germany and Toronto as their first point of reference. I'm not saying that there's not reason, because we have family there now in the diaspora. But what I am saying is cut out the middleman, cut out the middle leg of the journey that says to come from Botswana to Barbados, I got to go to London. Cut out all the aspects of the middle passage, which regretfully has scarred our relationship because of the heinous way in which it perpetrated hate and crime, and that regrettably still stalks our mental landscape, even if not our physical landscape. And I feel that, look at Kenya, with how Kenya leapfrogged with the M-Pesa and the digital and the telephone. Because if they had to build the institutional infrastructure to empower the 49 million people that they had there, it probably couldn't happen in the time frame. But the ability to use this telephone and to be able to allow it to be the center of communication and commerce and all of those things, to make geography a consideration that was almost irrelevant in the conduct of our affairs, they have been able to leapfrog, in my view, a generation. I'm asking you now, how can we similarly leapfrog that generation by recognizing that we don't stutter when it comes to providing money for certain development activities in our countries? So why are we stuttering in terms of developing and putting the funds in place for those air links and those maritime links that will eliminate the middleman, the middle passage, and the middlemen, and the middle leg, sorry.
Prime Minister Mottley, that's also about the legacy of our history, the undervaluing
Yeah.
of each other, the undervaluing of things that are not European, the European
That's why I said
experience.
emancipate yourselves first. And it hits me. From the time you emancipate yourself and you value this, you're going to find the resources for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And it starts off with something as simple as direct communication.
Yep.
How do we get information about each other, which doesn't have to pass through someone else's channel? How do we, and I think you've called for that, direct links of communication, trade, and air and sea transportation. I mean, West Africa is how far from us? 5 hours by flight?
It's closer than London.
Yes,
About the
much
same,
closer.
and closer than Montreal, about the same as New York.
Sure.
So that answers the question. And you know, one of the things that bothers me is that at what point we're going to stop talking about it. I am prepared, even where I stand, in an IMF program, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a climate crisis, to recognize that if I don't share what little I have, to create that institutional framework for those, we start with charters, or for how we work together and pool together in the Eastern and Southern Caribbean and agree that, look, 1 or 2 of us will have to go forward in order to make this thing sustainable. But at the same time, we need it on the other side too. And if we move information, move people, and move goods, we're going to win the battle. But there has to be a commitment to create the institutional structure to do that. Now, I actually feel that women have the ability to step outside of the box more than men, because women know what it is to have to try a thing, to try something, you understand, in order to see if it can work or not. And regrettably, the status quo doesn't want to do it because they don't need it. They're surviving without it. So how are we going to create those opportunities, recognizing that it is only those who don't have to defend the status quo and who don't want to defend the status quo that will bring about the change? And Graça Machel has been brilliant in articulating a lot of these issues in a number of the fora in the last few years that really says, look, what matters is this concept and the image of development. And what matters is recognizing that if you want things to remain the same, the inequities will remain. So I have to step out of the box to change it and to make progress on this leg of my relay.
I'm slightly off track, but I want to stay with this theme a little bit. You spoke about women's energies being needed. I think we would all agree. What we're on seems to me, as I said, a steep downward spiral, where all kinds of crises, and of course the existential crisis. And from the forum, I think one of the demands of women's perspectives, voices, and energies have to be part of the solution. What, from your experience of sort of claiming your space, not just as a leader, as a person, claiming your space, claiming your voice, what can you share with women who are seeking to find that place amongst those who are setting policy, whether it is within the state or the private sector or in communities? What would you say to them from your experience of getting there?
Break it down. Break it down always. Bite-sized chunks. Understand, one step at a time makes a mile. Sometimes you might jump even, but it's still one jump at a time, unless you want to fly. And we haven't yet gotten the ability to fly. And if you go back to Earl Lovelace's book, Salt, you will find out why Black people can't fly in the first 2 pages of that book. But to be back to seriousness, bite-sized chunks and deconstruct and reconstruct. I mean, people hear me say it and they feel that I just rest in a recitation over and over. But there's no magic bullet. You have to break it down and claim ground. Claim ground, settle, and move again. And more often than not, the major battles of history were not won in one fell swoop. They were won because people fought, claimed ground, refocus, move again, claim ground, refocus, move again. And that's why I say that in a very real sense, these conversations are important because they give context and they reinforce in people that more often than not, you had the right instinct. You just
Mhm.
didn't think that it was right because it came from within. And you need almost the experiences of others to reinforce and validate that you're on the right track.
Mhm.
And believe you me, I know what it is to go through the hornpipe, as you know. You
Mhm.
understand? In every sense of the word, in this thing called national service. And it happens in every forum, because that's what happens particularly in small states, but large countries have it too. It just presents itself differently. Um, you're not going to always get it right either. There
Yes.
are going to be times when you have to pause and say, wow, that one wasn't right. That's a gaffe. And how can I make it better? But as all of the personal empowerment things tell people nowadays, a bad is really just an experience, you know? And the
And it's
conversations are necessary
when you
to
say
validate in younger people that this is still the right path, even when you fall down, just as a baby will fall down as they're learning to walk.
when you say deconstruct, I'm really deconstruct, reconstruct. Are you saying find the meaning of the moment, understand the causes,
Yeah,
because you
it's more
have
than
to
a
do
moment.
that
Yeah,
to find a
yeah,
way forward?
yeah. Basically, it is to say, look, why are we really doing something?
Yes.
What is and if it's at the national level, these are the questions that I ask every day. What is the public purpose of what it is we're trying to achieve? Break it down. What are we really trying to do? Two, what's the public mischief that we need to avoid or avert?
Hmm.
How do we make sure that in doing what we want to do, we don't create something that is worse than what we have or that can hurt us more? That's what is the public mischief.
Yeah.
We live in a world where technology now is so ever present. So can we do it differently given the technological gains that we've had? Okay. And I can't even say over the decades because it's now over the months since we
Yes.
last dealt with this topic. And as always, there is always a consequence. So are there people who will now be enfranchised who were previously discriminated against when we make and settle this policy? Or are there people who we can empower? You understand? So you look at empowerment and discrimination, because if you don't see the people who are going to be impacted by the policy, then you've not done the job that you were elected to do or that you were appointed to do. And I say that with all sincerity, because we become sometimes too wrapped up in the notion of the academia of the all of the other things, especially at the institutional level, and we forget to see each other, and we forget to understand who we're here to serve or what it is we've come to do. And that's why I keep saying break it down, because you can get so lost in what is this noble goal that you're really not at the end of the day helping who you set out to help.
Okay. Thank you. I want to maybe continue along the lines of thinking about culture, because what you're talking about here to some degree is the culture of curiosity, the culture of analysis, the culture of inquiry, as a precondition or as part of the praxis of living one's life. It seems
Or leading countries that have had colonial experiences and for which much of the institutions are not designed nor set up for us in a modern world.
yes. And I suppose too also, and not also, no, I suppose definitely the culture of gender inequality, because we are also infused with socialization about what it means to be a boy, a girl, a man, a woman. We struggle with those messages, and we reproduce messages that are highly inimical to our development. So again, this whole question or this quest to deconstruct, as you say, and to reconstruct, we have to make those meanings very apparent to ourselves. I want to maybe move on to something that question that we got from Belize, and it's a reflection of the Governor General of Belize, Her Excellency Froila Zalem, and she's thinking that the UN should add a fourth pillar to the Sustainable Development Goals, besides the economic, besides the social, besides the environmental, she's thinking that we should add the pillar of culture. And I wanted and she's arguing that adding that cultural dimension to building sustainable development would bring about ethical development. I think what you were talking about, moral leadership as well, and respect for indigenous knowledge. What do you think about that?
We're singing the same song in harmony. We're singing the same song in harmony. Look, for me, the building and forging of a nation that is a previous and former colony cannot be done without deconstructing our culture and understanding which parts of it we need to keep and which parts of it we need to take out. How many Caribbean people tell you that when they were children, the grandparents used to tell them, stand out the sun, you're gonna get too dark. How many Caribbean people tell you that they hear people say, boy, I wish your hair was a little softer?
Yes.
Those basic things continue to haunt generations. And that's why I keep saying that even though we've removed the legislative and the outward manifestations of discrimination, apparently institutionally, the unconscious bias, a wonderful phrase it is, that captures the cultural realities of how people behave and what people expect and how they frame their aspirations. That is what we have now to do. And I'm so happy that in week after next, that the United Nations is having a review on the Durban conference. I spoke about it earlier this week. Culture is really at the center. I call it non-formal education. That's how I define culture. Non-formal education as to who we are and how we do and what we do and if we do, etc. And we want to run governments and we want to build societies and we want to achieve economic growth, but we don't look at the cultural realities of the persons who have to do all of those three things. Now, if you don't understand why I am so adamant on training Barbadians in the creative field, not culture now, cultural industries, it is because we need to overcome the box that our educational system placed all of us in when we went through it. And equally, the religious institutions that were associated with the state equally put us in that box. So you have the Anglican Church, the Church of England, which was the established church until 1968. And therefore, all of the things that go with it that tell you, don't speak too loudly, don't do this, don't raise yourself and be seen. All of these things literally then have implications, in my view, for whether we are going to be productive or whether we're going to take risks, whether we're prepared to go into professions that don't have that comfort level and that box to hold us down. Or it explains why our children are so rambunctious and creative when we catch them on the side of the road or in a playing field, but you put them in a classroom or you put them in a church or you put them in a job and all of a sudden, butter can't melt in the mouth. So that until we confront these issues, and in my view, we should have started before, but we certainly 40, 50 years after independence have to be in that space, because those of us who are children of independence have an absolute responsibility. And why? Because I'm already seeing in the generation behind us a willingness to accept the world in the image of mass media, mass social media. And yes, they see themselves as global citizens, and that's necessary. But you can't be a global citizen without Caribbean roots. Yeah. Because if you're a global citizen without those Caribbean roots, then the first high wind is going to blow you out and send you away. And I keep making the point that what we can't do is have that rigidity. We have to be able to bend. We have to be able, because we have gale force winds as part of our atmosphere, literally and metaphorically. And if we can't bend, we're going to break. So that how do we condition our people to look in the mirror, to love who they see, to have the confidence to know that I can say enough, enough. I don't have to say a lot.
Mm.
But equally, as I say enough, enough, I must be able to understand the English language, because if I only speak dialect, then I've given myself and literally made myself an amputee, because I then can't engage with the rest of the world. So how do we get that balance? That those civilizations that have existed for millennia in Africa, in Asia, tell you about balance, because that is the experience of humankind to survive. It is only in this latter part of civilization, the last couple of centuries, that we believe that the exploitation of a few in wanting to conquer the world and in wanting to see the world only in their own image, that must be elevated to what global civilization must be about. And what we've found, COVID and climate crisis. And if this is not a wake-up call to reverse centuries of that exploitative behavior, then we're in trouble. And what is the difference? Even when, because mankind is naturally aggressive and competitive, that's a fact. But even when we did that before, we were curtailed by the fact that we couldn't reach as far and we couldn't do as much. But now that technology allows us to reach where we want and to do what we want, we're finding now that it is becoming our biggest enemy. We are the architects of our own destruction. And if we don't pause and get the cultural balances right and the power relationships right and see the people that we need to see, just as the mosquito can be that insect that causes so much devastation, but we hardly ever see the mosquito when it is biting us. Then those people on the earth that we do not see are going to be the architects of our own destruction, because we have left them with no choice but to survive in the only way that they know how to. But the consequences of them surviving in that way is the very undermining of the rest of us. I don't know if I'm making sense to you, but that's how I see it.
Perfect sense, perfect sense. I think we all agree. Yeah, and I also like the metaphor of the mosquito. You don't see it, but it's biting you. Yeah. And it's there in multiples. It's there in multiples. I want to ask you, the sisters in the Asia Pacific region, they speak about it in the language of climate and environmental justice. And they point to the fact that the countries and those who have profited the most from this so-called development agenda, the post-World War II agenda, have contributed the most to climate degradation, environmental degradation. And that we have to get powerful countries to step up and be accountable, not only for cleaning up, but also for changing the development paradigm. I know that's also something you've been talking about quite a lot, for quite a long time. Are those countries hearing us? What can we do as civil society actors, those of us who are in civil society, to support this call, which of course has some urgency now?
You need to know where power is located and get them to change how they exercise it. And I say so with all sincerity. And I will say a lot more as we go along this journey, not necessarily in this interview. Many of the institutions that make the decisions now globally were formed at a time when the reality of the world was different. And the countries that came together to form them were those that existed at the time. Barbados was not a nation state. Trinidad and Tobago was not a nation state. Ghana was not one. Nigeria was not one. You understand? In Latin America, you have the reality that even though some of them existed, they were not taken to be on the same level, especially with the doctrines espoused from our northern neighbors that gave them that sense of superiority without calling themselves one of the original imperialist countries. These countries continue to be at the core of these institutions. And the institutions have invariably developed bureaucracies that are so Byzantine in structure that the ability to be able to talk to those who can make decisions, they have mirrored us in our invisibility, but don't get tied up
Yes.
We have this power and they have this power. But why have they done it? Because if we don't see them, we can't easily get them to change their mind and do the right thing. So management tells you it's up to the nation states. And the nation states tell you, well, we can't really do it on our own. And what you have then is a system of being unequally yoked, to use biblical language. So leaders of small island developing states, leaders of developing countries across the world, speak what they believe is truth to who they believe is power, only to find out that the rules of the organization don't allow for that kind of conversation. And that even if at the individual level, people appear to be sympathetic and empathetic, the decision-making process is ground to a halt and nothing happens. And we come back the next year and we have the same conversation and nothing happens. And we come back the next year and we have the same conversation. And regrettably, what is happening is that left to its own continued path of inaction, you then get societies being split and not being able to respond to their own citizenry. And then you get, in the shadows of 9/11 tomorrow, you get the terrorist events that rocked a whole world only because of the power of their media. But those terrorist events are happening in Africa and Asia without necessarily meeting and being seen globally because they don't have the platforms and they don't have the empathy for the loss of their lives in a way that we must have empathy for the loss of lives on this side of the Atlantic. All of these are things that I believe that should cause us to recognize that you can't keep saying the same thing over and over and over and nothing happens. And why is nothing happening? Because the power is invisible and the power is being exercised in the interest of a few, but remains deaf and blind to the condition of others. And that is why I say that COVID and climate offer opportunities. And even then, they still don't want to hear you. And even then, they still only want to see it in the context of the wider issue. You mentioned earlier my reference to the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. You know why I use that? No? Because when small island developing states were talking about our realities with climate, whether in the Pacific or the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean, who's listening? When we tell you that we need 1.5 degrees to survive and that we are seeing the consequences of climate, we call the groundwater crisis and the sargassum weed that comes up and literally stops people from making a living on coastal areas where the sargassum takes over. You know why we call what we call it? We call it the chronic NCDs of climate because it's daily, insidious, every day. And you know what we call the hurricanes? The hurricanes are the heart attack of the climate environment. And we all know, and how many times have we said it? We didn't start it. You go to Paris and you agree to something called the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage that is supposed to compensate those who are the victims of that behavior. That has largely been spurred as a result of greed or recklessness. What happens? There's no framework to give it teeth. There's no flesh on the Warsaw Mechanism. But yet, we're being told that we must follow, excuse me, a system that literally, at the private level, penalizes us if we do wrong to somebody else. Law of tort. We're not prepared, excuse me, excuse me. We're not prepared for it to go down a line that mirrors private behavior. So national entities can do as they like, cause these things to small island states, and nobody takes it on. So we change the narrative. Those countries between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, because that's the next group of countries to be on the front line. And that's what I said to the UN back in September 2018. Are we invisible? Are we dispensable? Does it matter And if it matters, then where's the action? Where's the action for adaptation? Don't tell me you're only interested in global mitigation, but you're not interested in adaptation, which is national. Don't tell me that you want to put $100 billion on a document to get small island states to sign off in Paris, and it never reaches reality. And 5-6 years later, 100 billion doesn't have the same value that it did then. But apart from anything else, you must understand and recognize the need for a disproportionate allocation of that to those who truly need. And those of us on the front line as small island states with limited capacity are the ones who need. And that's why I've been calling that of that 100 billion, if that's where it stands, or whatever amount it is, that while the small island developing states, AOSIS, represent 25% of the nations of the global community of nations, that we should get at least 40% of whatever is allocated, because we're starting from way down here to get up here. And therefore, there's a serious handicap that we start from. And don't let me add to that the absence of a development compact at the time of independence, because you left us with nothing, having extracted for centuries. And I use Haiti as the most powerful example of it. Not that it didn't happen to the rest of us, but the manner in which it happened to Haiti, for stepping up first on its own to want to choose to be free, and then having chosen to be free, to pay damages through having to share your customs revenue with a country that is no longer your colonizer. And then at the time when it matters most, when you need help, nobody's there to help you. And the help that you need can't just be dealt with even with a check, because it has to be accompanied by the reform of their behavior, because the check alone is not enough to stop the iniquity and the decline in the conditions that we have because of the climate crisis. So I really, really feel, Roberta, that what we're facing is going to continue for a little longer, because we've not had the recognition for the reform of behavior that is necessary globally. And if I doubted it, I go back to the vaccines. And if I doubted it, I look and see how the recognition that hurricanes can do serious damage in the US, but we don't remember that hurricanes and storms do serious damage in the Caribbean. And how are we going to work together to be able to avert or to mitigate at the very least what is happening to us? And part of me says that the battle is no longer, and that's why I call for global moral leadership, because it's not just about the conversations taking place at the level of world leaders. World leaders, and I've been in politics long enough to know that politicians and leaders respond to populations and contexts and circumstances. And what is needed is not a guerrilla movement of no's to vaccines. That really is a natural outcrop of all of the negatives that I just explained. What is needed is a serious movement of leaders across every level of society and every level of economic endeavor to be able to accept first what are the principles and what are the objectives that we really want to see. And to that extent, if you say we are a global village, then these are the things. We want to establish that in each country there should be a minimum level of development. There should be a floor to development. And if you don't know how to make it happen globally, start with Haiti.
Yes.
Start with some of us in the Caribbean and the Pacific that are already on the verge of having to make serious decisions because of these multiple crises that we are confronted. And don't only believe that the crises are health or climate related. Let's deal with the consequences to domestic production and agriculture that the WTO put on us by ensuring that we lost the capacity to produce because we could no longer protect those who needed protection at the very time that it happened. And all of these complex areas of development, or that there has to be you don't want to call it reparations, but call it development. There has to be a development compact to make up for the fact that at the time of independence, you didn't leave us with the capacity to provide schooling and housing and healthcare facilities, because our capacity to tax and our capacity to grow was constrained by the fact that we literally had everything extracted from us to build wonderful museums and wonderful institutions and railways and airlines and shipping lines.
Mhm.
5 million people from Nigeria died between World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
5 million Nigerians.
Yes.
You know that food was grown in the colonies to send back to the metropole to get through the wars. You know that our people gave their blood, and yet less than 2 decades later, people walked away without the settlement of any kind of development compact. So that when we talk about reparations, whether it was in Chile, when we did that 20 years ago this year, or when I went to Geneva and met with all of the delegations, and when we left Chile, there were only 2 countries in the hemisphere against the need for reparations: the United States of America and Canada. And both hid behind the fact that they felt that it would create precedent with their indigenous people. Well, it should create precedent with their indigenous people.
It should.
Okay, that's the point. And then you go to Geneva, and the only other countries on top of those 2 that came then were the Western European countries. And I'll share this, I've never said it publicly before. When I was there in Geneva meeting, and I went, and God bless Owen Arthur for this, because he understood the need for us to go at the time and have the level of consultation that we needed to lay the framework, because Barbados was that society where the modern construct for racism was practiced, refined, and developed, because it was that jewel in the British Empire, as you know, in the 17th century. And ironically, the 400th anniversary of modern settlement will come in 2025, less than 4 years away. But when we did that, what happened was that we lost the whole plot, and we became part and parcel of an appendage to a metropolitan and an imperialist ambition, that they, having recognized that they could no longer have an empire, did not even have the decency to say enough is enough. So we go to Geneva and we say, let's talk, because something is fundamentally wrong. And I quoted Earl Lovelace earlier, because Earl's book Salt is that book that deals with reparations for us. And it took him 10 years to write it. And I believe that that long journey is because of the complexity and the emotion involved with what I'm dealing with here. So we go to Geneva and we meet with every delegation that we can, in groups and individually. And all but the Western European countries and the US and Canada say no. But you know what was happening at the very same time? There were riots in England, not by Black people this time alone, but by Blacks and Asians the same weekend that we were meeting in Geneva. And the Germans were formally apologizing to the Jewish people for the Holocaust. And here am I in Geneva, meeting with all of these people. And yet there continues to be a refusal to treat Black people with the dignity and to say first and foremost, sorry.
Yes, say sorry.
Say sorry. And then secondly, to then recognize that even if I don't want to call it reparations, that these people live in this world, and that ancestors of mine would have treated their ancestors in a way that prevented them from being able to develop. And Europe didn't only underdevelop Africa, in the words of Rodney, it also underdeveloped the Caribbean. It also underdeveloped the Pacific. And all I'm saying is that we're meeting a moment in time where these conversations have to be had, where there has to be that kind of intervention. And the intervention can't be just words alone, but we need a development compact. And if you think that it is only for us, the climate crisis has shown that the migrants that will flow will affect you. And if you think it is only for us, the vaccine apartheid has shown that the mutations are affecting also those who have access to the largest amounts and who have held everything close to the chest. It is a lesson in motherhood.
Yes.
It is a lesson fundamentally in motherhood. You understand? You reap what you sow.
Yes. Prime Minister Mottley, we are at the end of our session. I want to ask you, what are your reasons to be hopeful?
Because I think that there's sufficient of those of us who, even though we don't have the power to change everything, and bewitch, Elizabeth used to do so and twiggle the nose, or in a genie, even though we don't have the power to change it instantly, that we are hearing and seeing things change and voices resonate with us, recognizing that 20 years ago, nobody believed that the climate crisis was real.
Mm-hmm.
But we now have people across the globe understanding that it is real. 10 years ago, nobody talked in mainstream media about the inequity of development, whether it is in the North Atlantic countries or in developing countries, but they talk about it now. And we are now having people recognize that books that talk about human capital are as valuable as books that talk about financial capital. And that in truth and in fact, when Fidel Castro spoke about the international financial markets being casinos, he wasn't mad, he wasn't deranged, but he was speaking about the fact that the world is trying to make money out of something that is ephemeral and fleeting. And what is futures and derivatives if not that? And
yes.
That really and truly, how can we concentrate on those things without first concentrating on obliterating hunger, obliterating poverty? And the UN has tried, and many good people and many developmental scholars and developmental activists have carried us. That's why I say it's a relay. But perhaps the language I should end on is not a relay. The language I should end on is like chipping in carnival. 3 steps forward, 1 step back, because history doesn't necessarily go in a straight line. And I am hopeful because when I look at history, even when there is that step backwards, like in mass, we continue to have a forward trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Mottley. This was, again, another tour de force. You break down very complicated, complex issues in the language that we can all understand. Your use of metaphor, your use of culture, all of it is intelligible. And to say I leave the global audience with your words, deconstruct, find meaning, understand the causes of your context, and reconstruct, find the solutions. And I like how you say, claim ground.
I want to say to you as well that I am so proud of the work that you are doing, not just in this Caribbean region, but what you've been able to do in the United Nations system, whether it is in the system itself or in Thailand or wherever else you've served. And the truth is that when you asked me earlier about the jobs and the opportunities for women, it is more like you and others that we need to be able to be carrying the flag, because the one thing I've learned is that you cannot have an army of 1 or 2 or 3. And in Barbados, we have that saying that one blow is kill old cow, because it is the cumulative impact of all of us acting together that will make the changes in the world. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Mottley. And I also recognize Professor Barito, the Honorable, who stayed with us for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Udine.